and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our friend, Ben Rattray. Careful of that little, there we go. We didn't practice this when you're going up here. How's it going, Ben?
How's it going? Oh, you can hear me. Good. Welcome, everybody. This is an office we moved into, I think, 4 years ago, the first Changeorg office. First, Matthew J. Slutsky, who some of you might know, Matt Slutsky, who now lives in New York, actually opened the first Changeorg office around the world in, I think, about 18th and K about 5 years ago in a single room, and now we've got a pretty cool space. So we're excited to have you guys here.
Awesome. So we always start our interview on a personal note, so let's go way, way, way back. Where were you born? Where you were raised? What did your parents do? And perhaps maybe talk about your first entrepreneurial experience or social entrepreneurial experience. Let's go back.
Yeah, so I'm from Santa Barbara, California, one of 5 kids, a big Catholic family. And my first entrepreneurial experience, so I loved baseball cards. I was like in the baseball card arbitrage business where I'd buy all these packs, and these like very old, now creepy probably men at the time would sell baseball cards and buy them at these like events every Saturday, and my mom somehow decided it was a good idea to take me all the time. But I was obsessed. And this is why actually I wanted to be originally an investment banker, because I was really obsessed with prices and with buying and selling. And that sort of extended all the way literally until I was like a junior in college.
So did you have did you make your first not Girl Scout cookies, but I mean, did you like do anything like a social entrepreneurial fundraising when you were younger?
No, I just tried to make money selling baseball cards.
Okay, got it.
It's funny. So when I grew up, I can contrive an example of. I was really involved. So I was a student body president in my high school, and so, this kind of story of my life is always these 2 different narrative arcs. One was me excited about business and enterprise in general, and then my excitement and engagement in politics and civic participation. And I had a healthy balance between both of them. But when I was younger, I thought that I'd first go into finance. I was very excited about walking down Wall Street in a double-breasted suit, and I thought that was the epitome of success. And then after success in business or success in banking, that I thought I'd go into politics. And I conceived of them as 2 discrete acts, as totally separate entities. And it was not until I finished university that I recognized the ability to combine the 2 and the potency and the power of doing both, not just one of them.
So obviously you went to Stanford, London School of Economics. Let's talk about Change.org when it first started. What was the aha moment? What was that like spark in your head? Say, you know what? This is how I see the vision of the future. How did Change.org start?
Yeah, it's funny because it was actually, I was living in DuPont Circle at the time. So when I graduated from, after going to Stanford, I was in London for a year. I came back. I worked with 2 fairly well-known political consultants, one on the Dem side, one on the Republican side. Learned about, power and politics, became rather disenchanted about what I thought to be the inability of everyday people to have voice in their own government. And then I decided to do the one thing that all the other intelligent people that I knew that were idealistic at the time but didn't know exactly what to do with their time, is I decided to go to law school. And then I was literally about to go to law school, a week away from NYU for public interest law, and I get access to an email address that gave me exclusive access to this very new social networking site in 2005 called thefacebook.com. I'm sure you've never heard of it. You just immediately recognized that the same technology that could connect people around friends and around photos could connect them around the issues that they cared about. And if you look at the history of organizing, the biggest impediment to effective social movements is the friction, the difficulty of collective action, right? The actual literal difficulty. There's a very famous problem in political science called concentrated versus diffuse interests, which is a small number of concentrated interests is able to overcome the collective action costs that impede people's ability to organize and have then for real power in politics, where a large number of diffuse interests, the public interest, right, they only have a small amount to gain for any amount of civic action. And so if the difficulty of organizing is high, then no organizing occurs, and small groups of people beat out large groups of diffuse interests. And there's just been nothing before invented in all of human history more effective at overcoming those collective action costs than not just the internet in general, but in particular social media. And I recognize that because I was obsessed with this problem and the inability that I saw in DC of citizens to actually have voice in their own government. And so when I recognized that, it was the genesis of starting the company.
Didn't you have like a personal story, perhaps your brother, where, let's talk about that, because I've heard this story.
This sort of
pretty good.
Yeah, the pivot that I'm trying to avoid. So when there's sort of a story that undergirds the transition from my inclination to want to be an investment banker to my desire to sort of dedicate my life to social change. So when I was a senior in college, I came back from my winter break, and I went and I talked to one of my younger brothers who came out as gay, really unexpectedly. And he said that the thing that was most hurtful for him as a young closeted gay American weren't people that were anti-gay, but those who refused to stand up and to speak out against them, like people like me. And, one of the closest people to me in my life, someone I loved and loved dearly, and I literally just never stood up and spoke out because I had no idea. I was totally ignorant, totally oblivious, and focused literally on my own success, and so self-centered at the time. And, it was the most ashamed I had ever been, and I didn't know what to do immediately, and I knew I couldn't do the same thing. I sort of, I looked at the future that I had, and I just saw the impoverishment of the pure pursuit of profit, of exclusively aspiring for sort of economic returns, and didn't know what to do. And the reason I went to London School of Economics was actually to read. I mean, I literally just read books every day. I actually read a book a day. It was a little bit depressing, but about political and economic theory and trying to discover about how I could actually be in service of something bigger than myself. And that's why then I came back to DC to try to figure out what is the practical implementation of that general theory about how I can affect change. And the frustration of that drove me to law school, which then made me realize about social media, which caused me to start the company.
It's really interesting you talk about your brother, because later on, Good Karma went around with the ban on the Boy Scouts, the gay and the Boy Scout. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. But first of all, I want to, since we're a crowd here of startups, we sort of drink the Kool-Aid of this whole lean startup approach. So I want to talk about, when you started in your house, 2007, you Change.org actually went through a lot of iterations, right? So it first started out with a social network and for social activism. That was the first one, and then it pivoted.
That failed.
Okay, and then it pivoted to a cause-based blogging platform.
Also failed.
Okay, and then three's a charm here. Then it's a petition platform in 2011.
Did not fail.
Okay, great. So this took 5 years to figure out. So if you had implemented lean startup, like get your MVP and product market fit, would you have gotten to this online petition idea a lot faster? And what do you think about that?
It would have been a lot nicer to have read the book after starting the company for 4 years. So a couple thoughts on the lean startup approach. I think that one of the things, it is immensely informative for rapid iteration and testing. I do think that some people oftentimes read too much into this, in that they will... the general perspective that I have on effective sort of epic enterprises that have done huge things for the world is they generally start with a fairly, I think a brilliant insight, ideally, with a big vision of what it ultimately can become. So Twitter wasn't new. It was, Jack had thought about this for a long period of time. It was a very simple insight of public publishing of status, or like Mark, Zuckerberg in the case of like a very simple way to connect and like hang out with friends and like hit on girls, which is literally the original idea, more or less. But it's not that they went out and said, we're going to do a lot of user discovery and ask people what they want, and then based on what they want, we're going to build something and then see if they like it, because most times the things that take off in the most significant way weren't obvious to begin with. And if people already were very clear about what they wanted, there would have been that product already in the marketplace. And so it does require two things. One, a degree of vision, and the second is a degree of persistence. And I think one of the most difficult thing for any level of sort of any internet product where you're iterating is when do you give up, when do you lean in. I was just talking to somebody last week who's, I think, a really impressive entrepreneur. He's been trying for about a year on his enterprise, which I think is a really big vision about trying to improve discussion, deliberation, and sort of ideation online. And he's sort of ready to give up because he hasn't quite hit it yet. And my question to him is, do you think definitively that you have an insight that is incredibly important and that there's something core to that that needs to exist in the world? And if you do, it is worth constant iteration to try to aspire to get there. And so I think that what we did well was we recognized that there's a basic insight, which is the new technology empowers people to come together at faster speeds, at greater scale than ever before, and there's something core and fundamental there that is potentially transformative for the world. What we didn't get right as much is the approach for how to go test lots of ideas against that common thesis. And so what I would do in retrospect, and the advice that I now give, is keep core to one's thesis and passion about the actual aspiration you have for what you want to build for the world, and flexible in the implementation of that. Because fundamentally, we have the same vision we had 9 years ago. It's kind of painful. 9 years ago. It just took us a lot of time to iterate to find the best tools to most effectively empower people to create the change they want to see. So be flexible in approach, but much more, I think, definitive than many people are on aspiration, given the passion you hopefully have for that idea.
And so February 2012, that's when it really hit. It shot up to the moon. During that month, you were growing faster each month than 4 years put together, right? Every month you were growing that fast. So my question is that, how did you scale up? Just in terms of just the staffing and then the engineering part of this, because I'm sure. I mean, did you have to hire folks from like Twitter and Google? Because the scaling up part of this is going to be pretty crazy. I mean, it's 10,000 petitions started each month.
Yeah, we did. I think that, again, if I were to advise myself or others in retrospect about this, I think one of the things we did not do well is build for scale when it became clear that we'd hit scale. So one of the things that, the inclination that most entrepreneurs have in the beginning when they're about to launch their product is, well, we're clearly going to go viral. This is such an incredibly brilliant idea that we need to build for massive scale to begin with. And that's the idea that we had, which was just not true because it takes a long time for iteration. It's a really good problem to have if you have scaling problems. And the second is, when it became clear we need to scale, we were scrambling to try to just, patch things and be good enough instead of thinking, wow, we clearly have product market fit. We need to fundamentally think about the infrastructure that we need to build to be able to support hundreds of millions of users. And because we didn't do that, and because I didn't spend enough time ensuring we had the talent required to do so, we didn't actually invest in enough engineering resources. It just made us much slower than we have been. And we're now finally, we probably have an engineering team of maybe about 75 now. We're finally catching up with a lot of the technical debt that we accumulated because we didn't do that right away. But I think for us, what would happen was we had pivoted a number of times, and we started to seeing more and more of these small, really kind of amazing campaigns emerge. I'll just mention one. The actual campaign directly preceding February in 2012 was December in 2011, and it precipitated this transformation, this shift, was this incredible campaign in South Africa where this woman really tragically was walking down the street in Cape Town, and she gets grabbed and thrown into a shack and raped and almost killed. And the reason is she's a lesbian woman, and the man was trying to turn her straight. This awful practice called corrective rape was quite common in Cape Town at the time. A friend of hers had this happen to her partner as well, just about 6 months before. And Ndume Funda is her name, remarkable woman. And she, in reaction to this Starts a Changeorg campaign, had seen other campaigns in Uganda previously to that, has no network, no real personal connections, ends up getting 150,000 people from 150 countries in a few days, becomes the biggest story in South Africa that week, embarrasses the government, gets mass mobilization, huge amount of press attention. She mobilizes people using the tool offline, protests in front of Parliament, and a few weeks later, the government acknowledges the issue for the first time in history, apologizes, and passes a national task force to investigate and to stop the incidents of corrective rape in that country. I mean, like a really remarkable, truly remarkable, beautiful. And what it showed to us is sort of we had previously hired and had 200 freelance bloggers writing about social issues every day. And what we realized we needed to do was just get out of the way. And if you provide everyday people with tools and guidance to create their own campaigns and their own voice on the issues that they themselves own, then you have massive potential for scale. And that's how we then literally pivoted. We ripped out all this content. We turned the entire company around. I mean, it was a quite significant shift in like a month and a half, but it was like we clearly saw the future potential, and we didn't want to stop at anything. And so we actually made a fairly bold move of removing all these prominent blogs because that was not going to be the future of where we needed to go.
So this is really interesting. That one campaign. Now I want to talk about the other interesting campaigns. I actually Googled the most successful Change.org campaigns. That was one of them. The other one was the ban on gay scouts. Which
Love this campaign.
Right. So this was basically overturning 100-year policy and changing that in 9 months. Right. Literally in 9 months. So let's talk about that. Like what was the backstory
How
behind
does that happen? Yeah.
Yeah. This
so
is
I think
amazing.
and I'll tell this story because I think it's so important to recognize the transformation that's happening right now in advocacy and how one goes from the traditional model of sort of very large, generic, big campaigns that oftentimes are very difficult to win to small, specific, personalized campaigns that are much more viral and end up building momentum from the ground up. We talk about, maybe I'll talk about in a second, kind of how we think of, from a structural perspective, the campaigns that are most effective. But so there'd been a fight all the way to the Supreme Court in 2001 to defend the right to ban gay scouts. That was won in a 5-4 decision and stayed. And so on a regular basis, gay scouts had been kicked out of the Boy Scouts. And about 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, 3.5 years ago, there is a 32-year-old mom who's a den mother, who's 3 adopted kids with her partner, and her community knew she was gay but thought this is a ridiculous national policy, and they asked her to be a den mother. She does. She becomes so prominent. She gets known by the National Scouts, and they kick her out of the Boy Scouts. Nothing new except that she realized she could do something about it. She starts a Changeorg campaign, gets 300,000 people to join, becomes mass mobilization across the country, a huge media story. She flies down to Florida to deliver the petition to the National Boy Scouts Council, their annual event, and they 100% reject her requests. They reaffirm the anti-gay policy, and that would be normally, in most people's case, the end of it, right? She tried, got lots of mobilization. It didn't win, but she also didn't give up. She asks, what else can I do? And she finds out that on the board of the Boy Scouts, there are 2 Fortune 500 CEOs of very gay-friendly companies, high in Human Rights Campaign's Equality Index. And she decides to petition the CEO of AT&T and of Ernst & Young to either come out against the anti-gay policy consistent with their own company's policies or resign. And 6 hours and 600 signatures later, the head of Ernst & Young becomes the first board member in the history of the Boy Scouts of America to come out against the anti-gay policy. And then 2 days later, the head of AT&T does the same thing. And then another young man, a prominent now, Eagle Scout who has 2 moms, Zach Walls, starts a petition because he finds out that the biggest corporate donor of the Boy Scouts is Intel, which has $1 million donation, and they have a non-discrimination policy in their donation policy. So he petitions them to be consistent with their own donation policy, gets about, I think, 40 to 50,000 people to join, and within a week they pull out $1 million. He finds the next biggest one is UPS, does the exact same thing, and $800,000 gets pulled out. And then more than 100 campaigns across the country emerge out of this, one of which is this remarkable story of this young boy, 17 years old, has been a Boy Scout for 12 years. He creates a tolerance wall in his middle school against bullying. He's about to get his Eagle Scout badge. They find out he's gay. They kick him out of the Boy Scouts. His mom sees these campaigns, starts her own petition. In his defense, 500,000 people join. He's on Ellen, Anderson Cooper, all over the media, embarrasses the California Boy Scouts so much they become the first regional to come out against the national policy. All hell breaks loose. So many more campaigns. And 9 months after unequivocally rejecting this request, the Boy Scouts turns around 180 degrees, apologizes, and accepts gay members for the first time in history. Awesome campaign. Love that campaign.
That was awesome, yeah.
And a quick thing about this is, I think about 3 concepts that actually followed in a pretty remarkable way that inform the future, I think, of effective organizing online and off. First is you think of sort of big to small, right? Most people think of very, very big campaigns. The goal is this epic, heroic victory. But actually, the best way to win big victories is many, many, many small victories. The second is from abstract to personal. If you'd ask the average person, right, should private organizations have the right to determine who their own members are based on their own affiliations? Or in the abstract sense, you might say, 50-50, yes or no. If you said, should Ryan Andreessen be kicked out of the Boy Scouts just because he's gay? You have a very different public response. And so people access issues through personal stories, not abstract numbers, and providing a platform for people to articulate how policies impact real people's lives is, I think, tremendously important. And the third piece is one campaign to many, right? So big campaigns to small campaigns, abstract to very personal, and then starting from one and exploding to many. And we're building a platform that's really the model of how most effective social movements have been run since, the civil rights movement certainly follows this, right? It's a very big problem. The idea that you would start that from a public narrative perspective because a woman refused to walk to the back of a bus seems like crazy. But it's a very big problem, started with a very, very small campaign. It was a very abstract issue made very personal in her case, right? It started with one individual bus boycott, but it spread across the country. And that is what we're trying to do, is build the tools that radically reduce the barriers to those kind of movements from emerging.
I like how they, for this particular case, they use money to
As a lever.
As a lever, right? I mean, $1 million you lose in sponsorship, that's going to get some CEO's attention. But let's talk about another campaign. In this case, it's the George Zimmerman over the death of Trayvon Martin, where his parents started a campaign, right? And eventually it caught on fire, and then then the president got on that. So what was behind that? That was a pretty amazing.
Yeah,
campaign.
it was an incredible and tragic situation. I mean, you had a real deep tragedy of a kid shot and killed, completely innocent, and there's no real media reaction in the immediate aftermath of Trayvon Martin's death, and it really took about 2 weeks. There had been an article that had come out in Miami about it, but then we were connected, and his parents decided to start a campaign, and it featured a few users. It got a huge amount of attention and attraction, then went viral. Millions of people joined it, and then it, of course, spawned a huge number of additional, media moments, which then end up carrying, beyond the petition for sure. I mean, one of the things that's notable about petitions is that they end up, people, if they have a very focused view on just the campaign itself, I think it's too narrow of a perspective. And oftentimes, if done very effectively, ends up spawning a huge public narrative shift around a different issue, and that helped to spark that narrative shift and gave his parents a means of communicating on a regular basis with the audience of people that were most passionate about that issue. And then the president got involved, obviously, in whatnot. And we've now worked with the White House, has now just responded to another campaign on the site, and we're going to work with them more and more in integrating with the White House petition site. But the final thing I'd just say about that is it was a tragic example of a private injustice, right, made publicly manifest. You have, what's happening right now. I would say one thing about the Black Lives Matters movement. It's not that these are new problems, right? They're just newly visible. Like, things were even worse before. It's just the case that right now, in real time, people can take a video, and that is a remarkable thing. And that kind of transparency and exposure is so powerful, and it's only just beginning. It will deter behavior significantly. It will transform policy over time. It is happening slower than many understandably would like, but I think that taking private injustices and manifesting them publicly, right? They're so difficult to avoid, and they're so difficult to justify if you can throw them in people's faces and in front of their lives on a daily basis, and that's a powerful thing. We think about kind of the impersonalization, the depersonalization that the internet enables. On the one hand, that's true. You can hide behind this facade of the web. On the other hand, it's a phenomenal means of spreading personal stories and building solidarity. And the ability to transform people's identity and their perspective by virtue of introducing to you immense sort of the reality of what's happening around them through the lens of other people's eyes is so powerful. And I think that is actually much more powerful and will be an overriding theme in how we end up determining public policy than the depersonalization that we've seen with anonymity online.
So we talked about really serious campaigns here. What's the most ridiculous campaign you've seen on the platform? I know there's a lot, but like, what's
my favorite first campaign that was quite popular was around this band you might have heard of called Nickelback. So I'd literally never heard of this band before, and apparently they were named. They were named to be the sort of halftime show for the Detroit Lions Thanksgiving game. And apparently they're not American. They're Canadian, which is like a big deal. And there was a University of Michigan student that started a petition to, I think it was like CBS, to rescind the invitation to pull it because they were so bad, so offensive, and they couldn't believe that in Detroit, of all places, you couldn't find a better band that was American. So 50,000 people joined this campaign in like 6 hours. It was, I think, our first coverage on ESPN. ESPN loved it. And then actually Nickelback, in their defense, come with a fairly funny response on Funny or Die. And they respond to the petition. They understand. They're sympathetic with Americans. They realize they're Canadians. I don't think they realize like the reason people mock them is not mostly because they're Canadians. But anyway, but we see this like look in general. I would say two quick things. One is on this, we're an open platform where we want to meet where people are, right? A lot of people take action on the things that are most proximate to them. And proximity can mean things like physical. I get really excited about half the petitions on the site are literally in your immediate vicinity. So it's local campaigns. One thing we're about to launch in the near future is mobile, and the ability to go pull out your phone and immediately see that physically around you, what are the campaigns that are trending, literally like your neighborhood park or better food for your kid's school. As you physically cross paths in your world, how do you organize with other people that have gone through the same space but not at the same time? Like that has never been before possible. I think it's so powerful. And it's some things where people really care about things like whatever topics they care about, their university, their friends. Like we think it's really important not just to superimpose on people the most grave issues of our time, the most important issues of our time, because folks are diverse and they access incremental issues before they want to go fight corrective rape or acid attacks outside the U.S., and that's understandable. The second thing I'd say is a number of the examples we've mentioned, I think they are fairly transcendent, increasingly nonpartisan issues. It's also the case we're an open platform. We think fundamentally, one of the most exciting things today is actually giving power to people in their own hands, in their own community, and that is fundamentally not a liberal or conservative thing, and in many cases it is more historically a conservative thing, but the ability to empower people to participate in their own community, have control in their own lives, to be able to determine policy and participate civically in the town square, most immediate to them, that is, regardless of political party, I think an unequivocally good thing. And we get really excited about increasing engagement in local contexts where things are not just, left or right. They're not that partisan. We see this all the time where campaigns, things that seem to be and are characterized as hyper-partisan in a national context, when they localize in your own community, they're very, very different. And we're excited about getting out of the very difficult, challenging, and seemingly excessively polarizing conversation about our national politics to the 99% of decisions and elected officials who don't actually live in D.C., as important as D.C. is. We think that's really important.
So I didn't want to break the flow of what you just said.
Sorry.
I wanted to go back to the most ridiculous petition, and I did a little bit of research, but so I just did just look at the top searches on the site, and then so I saw like Deadpool to host SNL. That was one there. Ban Sporks. On
Ban Sports.
Ban Sporks. The spoon and fork. Ban Sporks.
Like
Yeah.
Ban
That was
Sports.
actually
I love sports.
Yeah. They wanted to ban that.
I don't like sporks either. I would sign that.
and then on top of what you just said with Nickelback, they actually had a Weird Al Yankovic ban because he was going to perform Super Bowl halftime, so they put a petition for that as well.
I mean, that guy is iconoclastic, so that makes sense.
But actually, what's really interesting here is that one of your most successful campaigns was actually release Grand Theft Auto 4 on PC.
Which is why we started the site. I forgot that part of the story. Not in defense of that, but to explain the underlying, we want to live in a world where people believe their own voice matters, right? Where people who have the sense that when they say something, they will be heard. Not that they will necessarily win, but that actually they will be recognized as such. Like people so often the case, literally one of the biggest challenges, my fears of our democracy, is people losing hope that their voice is of consequence. And so if even in those contexts, which are not the most serious clearly, but you actually get the direct response from a multinational company because you and 50,000 other people that are passionate said we just got screwed by this one company and now we're getting a direct response, and you have that CEO or that company change a policy, it's quite empowering actually. And so while we didn't start and don't optimize the site around those types of campaigns, even those types of campaigns in many cases actually affirm the broader narrative that we're trying to instill, which is how do you have a world in which people believe their voice matters?
So I wanted to delve into the best practices for Change.org campaign. So, I mean, it's almost like Kickstarter, and I advise a lot of startups when they do crowdfunding. They're like, "Hey, man, we're just gonna put it online, and we're just gonna sit
It'll
back."
go viral.
Yeah, exactly. And so I feel that maybe
Because that happens.
I'm thinking maybe perhaps a lot of the users for your site think the same way. So what is the best approach? Like, you should have obviously an online strategy as well as an offline outreach strategy. So what tell us about that?
Let's first talk about this sort of the biggest, one of the most, I think, under sort of appreciated and frequently sort of problematic issues online and in the entrepreneurial sector, which is the outlier effect, which is the only petitions that most people see have hundreds of thousands of signatures, kind of by definition. Because if you have, you don't have hundreds of thousands of signatures, it just means that no one really saw the campaign. And it's the same thing with like funding for entrepreneurs. Like most entrepreneurs I know, they're like, God, it's so easy to get funding, all these funding announcements. Like nobody writes about a non-funding announcement. Like it's not an announcement. If you didn't raise money, nobody writes about it. So literally, like, I'll have friends that, went to Stanford, were first at like up now. There's multiple people that went to a public company, like crushed it. They were the second employee. They made a ton of money. They couldn't raise money. Like this stuff is really, really, really hard. And it's the same thing around like app downloads on, on sort of phones. It's like, God, I mean, all these apps that I see have like millions of downloads. It's like, yeah, I know. Because the ones that didn't have millions of downloads, no one saw them. And so that's like literally 0.0001%, literally that kind of size of the percentage throughput. And so one is just setting expectations. Again, this is even outside of petitions. Like this stuff is really, really hard. So from the company side of things, the reason that one of the most frequent pieces of advice I give to other entrepreneurs is like, are you fighting for, are you starting a company that even if it were unsuccessful, you'd be proud of what you did? Because assume you will fail. But for 4 years you will fight, and that is a worthwhile pursuit because there's dignity in that, and you think it is something that is worth investing in. If you couldn't say unequivocally to yourself, I'd be proud of fighting for 4 years and failing, then you should probably give up unless you're already taking off. Because the chances are that you'd fail, and there's nothing more tragic than failing and not being happy about how you spent your time. On the flip side, if you're doing something you think is one of the most important things you could possibly be doing in the world, like it just doesn't matter. The reason we fought, really we had like 2 years of pretty epic failure and then 2 years of like middling somewhat success, and then things have gone better since then. But yeah, the reason we're able to go through it all is because we thought this is the most important work we could possibly be doing. And so even if we failed, which we didn't think we'd do, but even if we failed, right, we'd be okay with it. So on to petitions. As advice, one is, I should say that the median number of signatures on a victory, meaning of all the campaigns, more than 10,000 campaigns have won, right, actually literally changed a law or got a company to change a policy. Of those, the median number of signatures is 388. Crazy low, right? A lot of these are like saving local parks and, sort of, better policies for your, let's say antibiotics in your food for your kid's school. Lots and lots of little things like not having a dump truck back up and have at 6 a.m. wake your kids up. Like literally these are campaigns that have happened in New York. So I'd say one is, what is your goal? The biggest thing we think is actually not necessarily the number of signatures, but the strategy underlying it. So what is your aspiration? And we say, what is something that is big enough to be meaningful, but small enough to be winnable within a short period of time? So you think of like the Boy Scouts of America example. It may be the case that your real goal fundamentally might be LGBT rights, full equality, around every issue in the country. That's a really hard campaign to win. Let's apply it directly to the Boy Scouts. That's actually really hard to win outright. Jennifer Tyrell tried. How do you then break it down even smaller to like maybe an associated organization, a company that donates to the Boy Scouts? Could you get them to change a policy? Maybe yes. And so one is like the strategy behind it is actually the most overlooked component of effective campaigning. Both because ironically, or I should say paradoxically, you would think that the smaller, more narrow, specific campaign, the fewer signatures you might get because the less and less audience that might be interested. It's the contrary. You could start like a general petition around, let's say, climate change nationally, and you might get like, it's not a very exciting campaign, but you have a 13-year-old girl petition her own city council to get a tax on plastic bags, which happened outside of Chicago and Illinois, which got 100,000 people to join it because it's like a crazy, compelling story and totally winnable and therefore exciting and got lots of media coverage. So the most important thing, I think, to us is what is the goal and how do you break it down in such a way to give it a real chance of success? And then signatures are a secondary consideration to that.
I wanted to follow up on the discussion of funding. So how many of you here are you're a social startup? Raise your hand. Social startup,
like mission-driven startup,
okay.
Social enterprise.
Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you are actually trying to raise money? Okay, so there's quite a few here. This is a very interesting topic because when you think about social enterprises and raising money, you guys went through a different path where you actually went towards high net individual investors versus institutional investors. Why did you guys do that? What was the strategy behind that?
We wanted to make it really hard on ourselves. A lot of conversations. So one of the challenges with traditional venture capital is, and I think that there are a lot of companies that should raise VC money, and it makes total sense. It's the best way to scale. It's not easy. But if you can get it, it's sort of a large amount of capital. You get a lot of institutional support. If you plan on going public, and that's the path, oftentimes you want to have that kind of, sort of expertise on the board and whatnot. So there's good reasons to take venture capital. There are also some reasons, downsides. One of the downsides is sort of expected liquidity path. So the expectation is not only if you get funded by VC, would you have a one-time liquidity event, meaning you sell the company or go public. But the timeline that you look upon that is oftentimes the coincides with the timeline of the fund, not necessarily the timeline of what's best for the company. So most funds, right, they have limited partners. So they have, let's say, 50 different individual investors. They put money into the venture fund. They then need to return capital within 7 to 9 years. Now, within 7 to 9 years, if you think you actually don't want to do that, as an entrepreneur, you think you should actually spend more time building the business, there's sometimes this conflict between the interests of that organization, the business, and the interests of that individual shareholder. So both because the plan for us is to stay independent indefinitely, that's our aspiration, is private company indefinitely, and not to have necessarily go public. And because we don't have a 7 to 9 year time horizon, we want to build a company for 30, 50, 100 years. We preferred, if we could, to raise money from individuals, and that's why we pursued that. And we were fortunate to be able to do it. And the most effective for us in that was, the best way to raise money from 10 very high net worth individuals is to start raising from 1. And then you get 2. And they certainly didn't all come at once. But now we have, a great set of backers and excited to have them involved.
What was your first investor? Was it Bill Gates, or who was the first one? Because, there was a lot. There's a huge list of...
It was Pierre Omidyar, so the founder of eBay, was the first major investor. And then sort of, there a couple other came, founder of Twitter and of not Jack Dorsey, Ev Williams, and then of Yahoo, and then Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, who's been hugely supportive and we are a very big fan of, who's doing really incredible, important work in the world, both through LinkedIn but also in his private personal work.
So would you suggest going through, getting connected? Obviously all these guys are all connected, so It all started from Pierre, and then Bill Gates, and then Richard Branson, and everyone else, right? Yeah,
it's definitely a strategic. And the most important thing is having a compelling vision and some amount of data to indicate that you can actually achieve it. But the first is the most important. In particular, if you're going to raise from high net worth individuals, it's not that these people have sort of lack of opportunity for either investments or places to spend their time. So the most important thing was the default is no for any investment, but even for a meeting, even more than VCs whose job it is to deploy capital. If you're a VC, you have to actually find deal flow. If you're Branson, you live in the Virgin Islands, you don't have to do anything. It's pretty good. I've been there. It's quite nice, right? His life is, and although I will also say that he, in all of our investors, is immensely excited about mission-driven enterprises. It's been very cool to see, and this is accelerating over time. He, in particular, is excited about mobilizing other high net worth individuals into this. But yeah, do you have a if we had another photo sharing app, photo sharing is not bad. Like that's actually the communication-based applications that facilitate better connection and camaraderie. I'm not kidding. Is actually really powerful. I think that Instagram is actually net positive for the world. I think there are too many probably, but I do think that a lot of these otherwise seemingly trivial apps sometimes do real good in the world. I think Facebook net positive and will be more and more. But I will say that if you want to raise money from people like this, you have to have a really big idea that they're going to be excited about.
Hashtag startup grind at B.
At BRATTRAY.
Okay, please.
At Rattray.
Rattray, yep. Please tweet out. Switching gears here. So now this is sort of the spotlight of your new product, Changepolitics. This seems very interesting. I feel like after doing a little bit of reading on this, I mean, this could be the next disruptive thing out there for paid campaigns and political affiliation. But let's talk more about that. Like, what is so? There's two things. There's the Q&A and the personalized ballot. So let's talk more about that. What is it? How did the idea come about, and what are you trying to do with this new product?
The aspiration is to improve voting in America. We think it's a broken system, and it's broken in many ways. But the primary way in which it's broken is it's an information problem, we think, in a significant fashion where most people walk into a voting booth, look at a ballot, which will have, in some cases, dozens of different candidate offices and dozens of different candidates, and have no idea who most of these people are, and literally guess. That is very problematic for how to determine the future people that lead our democracy. And that is literally what happens on a regular basis in the world's what we think to be greatest democracy. That is tragic and problematic and necessarily needs to end. It is also the case that while you will walk into a voting booth in 2016 with a ballot that has the same amount of information that it had 200 years ago, which is the name of the candidates and party affiliation, you'll be walking in with the single most powerful device of information the world has ever seen, your smartphone. And that is clearly your ballot guide. And the ability to have somebody pull out that ballot guide, or rather their phone, and immediately say, well, who are the people that I trust the most? Who are the people that I respect, or the organizations whose opinions that I really trust? Follow those people like I follow people on Twitter. Get all of their recommendations or endorsements for candidates. Layer it on a personalized ballot based on where I live. Be able to look at that, and for any different office, immediately see of the 10, 15, 20 people I respect the most, what exactly they have to say about those candidates, and then vote with information and confidence on the people that I should actually be supporting. That is a dramatically different experience than we have today, something that is eminently possible and can transform incentives, I think, for candidates in the future. So very excited about that.
So the Q&A, I wanted you to talk more about that because I thought this was kind of interesting. You could submit questions, and if I wanted to vote for Trump or Hillary, right, like I should be able to see like a direct answer from the candidate themselves for my question, right? Is that the Q&A?
Yeah, so there's two. The endorsement side of things is ultimately what we're trying to do is build this personalized ballot for every American. There's ways to engage in advance of this as well, which is how do you directly engage with the candidates instead of passively consuming all this information from sort of candidates, either press releases or just mediated through the media. How do you actually have direct communication on issues that citizens care about most? And so we have a way in which candidates can directly engage with citizens around this. But the ultimate aspiration is how do you make it the case that you both inform people about who they might want to vote for, not just for president. It's actually most useful for every other office. School board, superintendent, judgeships, propositions, initiatives, things that are immensely consequential to the future of your communities in this country that people are literally just guessing on. And what we're especially excited about is the net results of people individually identifying the people they trust the most is a trust network for politics. So, for example, you might say in a place like D.C., so you could either, as a candidate for mayor in this next election, go to try to raise $20,000 with a bunch of special interests or small, high-net-worth individuals or industry groups, or convince someone who has 20,000 followers on Changepolitics, which means that person's endorsement appears on the mobile phone of 20,000 people that trust them just before they vote. That is worth more than $20,000. The only reason you care about $20,000 is because it will buy attention, which get votes. I mean, the thing about our democracy is, although we like to call it corrupt, it's not exactly accurate. Because all that elected officials care about are votes. It's just tragic that the most effective way to get votes right now is to raise money to buy attention to get votes. But as people's attention, the determination for who they vote for is more and more a function of what the people they trust say, friends and others they respect, and they can easily access that, then the people who are most trusted become the most influential. And that's the transformation we're trying to enable.
No, that's interesting because, the candidate that has the biggest budget, it's pretty much, they're the ones that usually win because
there's a very high degree of correlation. Some would call it causal.
Okay.
Not always in presidential, but it's remarkable actually in congressional. Right. I mean, it really is. Again, there's correlations. Incumbents would win anyway because they have high name recognition, the franking privilege, which gives them access to other resources. Anyway, there's lots of reasons why. But we think what's remarkable is you look over the past 15 years, what the consumer internet has done is just massive democratization, decentralization of a tremendous number of industries. You see this in a lot of investment commerce. So it started with eBay, and used to have to have a brick and mortar and all this sort of paperwork to have a store, and eBay let anyone have a store. And then, of course, that's been democratized so much now where, with Airbnb, anybody can be a hotelier, right? You have this with commerce, you have this with communication. It used to be incredibly difficult to publish information in the world, a few thousand publishers of information in the world. Now anyone can be a publisher. You have this around transportation now, democratizing transportation. We haven't actually democratized democracy. We've literally transformed all these other industries. We made them far more, I think, a better experience for consumers, for the public. But the experience of participating and the outcomes of our democracy are far worse relative to all these other pursuits. And there's two possibilities here. One is that somehow politics or democracy is fundamentally different and we're never going to improve it. And the second is we just haven't built it yet. And if you were to ask someone 5 years ago, if you were to say, that we think, in 5 or 10 years, let's say in 10 years from then, you're going to be able to pull out your phone, press a button, get a self-driving car that would pick you up and then automatically, algorithmically identify the best path to pick up two other people, all of whom get dropped off at nearly the same space for $2, right? As much as a bus ride. Literally within 15 years of 5 years ago, you think they're fucking crazy, right? But that's going to happen. Totally going to happen. Literally that transformation. People radically underestimate the impact that the smartphone has in almost every industry. And health, it's going to happen. I'm going to have a plug-in in my wrist. It'll have my real-time vitals. I'll be able to, amazing, amazing transformation that will also happen in politics. And I cannot wait because that will change, I think, a lot more than people think.
So this is great, talking about a little bit about the future. So let's talk about the future of change.org. We were in the back and we were talking about this. Internet voting is a big possibility. It's probably going to happen. Do you see Change.org being an integral part of that? Because, with this personalized ballot that you had talked about, I'm going to vote. I want to see all my trusted friends and, where they... Do you see a future with Change.org and
I think
voting?
there's... So, in the medium term, I think our aspiration is to build the sort of tools that provide infrastructure for democracy. So how do you actually... Right now, the channel of communication to elected officials in Congress is wretched. You have this sort of, bombarding, and, we're part of this because there's no better way right now, but bombarding members of Congress with email without having a sort of signal to noise, any easy way of communication. And what we're trying to build is actually a platform that lets elected officials of all levels see immediately all the campaigns, the opinions of their constituents, all the petitions, and also who those people are, and have an easy way of engaging them and effectively communicating. And if we do our job, we have the kind of scale, the sort of user base, where we provide the incentive for elected officials to want to directly engage and respond openly and transparently to their own constituents. And frankly, we think it's in the interest of elected officials once we hit the kind of critical mass where it's in their electoral incentive. And so we just see rolling out more and more sort of this infrastructure for democracy, so better tools for communicating with all types of elected officials, voting using personal voter guides, and eventually voting via the internet as well. So that's one vector that we're on. And the second vector is the companies that I think that I respect the most have built massive platforms with huge installed user bases that leverage that for much wider purposes. And so if you look at what Google's done, they had one core iconic product, search. They had massive user adoption, brand adoption, penetration, resources, and expertise, and they then leveraged that for all these other aligned products You've had the same thing with Amazon, the same thing with now Facebook is doing this sort of in a sort of GE-like way, really in a Berkshire Hathaway kind of way, acquiring different properties. But we think, if we have 500 million engaged users around the issues they care about, it's a platform that allows us to syndicate across that network other opportunities to get involved. I can sign a petition, I can go help vote, I can contribute money, I can go volunteer, I can go figure out where I want to buy the best products that are ethical, whatever it might be. If we have a very large engaged user base around social issues, how do we empower people to create change using all the resources they have? And that's part of the future that we'll have as well.
So what about the future of Ben? You're going to be with the company for the next 30 years, and what's going to happen after that? You're going to run for office, run for president?
Not going to run for office.
I'll put a petition in for you.
I will say on the running for office side of things, Nick, raise your hand. Nick, who helps run Changepolitics, who ran for Congress for independent candidate 2014. I think had the highest vote total of any independent candidate, and ran when he was 25. Yeah. So so Nick actually is now part of an organization or sort of helping advise. He works with us, helping lead Changepolitics, but called Run for America. I do want to call out, I think that there's a real problem and perversity of this sort of, because we oftentimes, even in DC, but condemn politics and politicians, we get what we characterize. When you sort of, one of the challenges is how do we recruit more and more impressive people into political office? If we denigrate, if we disparage people that are running for politics, you're going to end up making it a less and less attractive occupation, and we need to make it the opposite. There's no more consequence than the decisions that are being made that literally have trillions of dollars at stake, or even in a local context, hundreds of millions of dollars at stake in even small counties and localities. And so what I want to see is social entrepreneurs in the future thinking, well, I can start a company, for profit, for good, or a nonprofit, or frankly run for office, and running for city council is probably going to have higher expected value, positive impact in the world than starting another nonprofit in many cases. And so I think that is immensely important. I want to be helpful and supportive of that. I don't know that I would necessarily do it, although I'll advocate for it and help advance it. And I think that the impact that I can make, that I think that we can make most, is standing behind people, supporting their efforts instead of front of them, advocating ourselves.
So I have a little prediction.
Yeah.
I feel like somebody in this room is going to be the next mayor of DC using your change.org.
Make it happen.
Because really, like all they really need is 1% of the DC population, which is 67,000 signature. To
get a bunch of signatures, get all your friends to endorse you publicly. People of prominence will get a lot of media exposure. Now, I'm very excited about what's possible with using the Changepolitics platform as a means of taking candidates that otherwise wouldn't get a lot of attention, publishing the influencers that they are able to, on a one-to-one basis, convince they should actually be winning and getting more attention, and therefore building grassroots energy and awareness about their campaign.
So I think I have maybe one or two questions left. So our final questions, we don't have time for Q&A. Sorry, guys.
Sorry.
You could do a petition for asking Ben questions later, right? Yeah. So the final question would be, like, if 10 years ago you're sitting in a crowd like this, and listening to a badass entrepreneur, what would be some random dude? Like, what would be the single best advice you would have given to yourself 10 years ago?
Two things. One, for building a consumer internet property, like, simplicity sells. Like, we built so much complexity. We overbuilt to such an extent that literally, like, if you would have told me 9 years ago that the core fundamental of our product is a petition, there's a lot around that, but, like, that's the core, I'd think you're crazy. But, like, actually, if you look at the most iconic companies around, sort of eBay, auctions is eBay, and books really has been Amazon's core in the beginning, and video is YouTube, and search was Google. It's a single, simple, powerful product. And so simplicity is a feature, not a bug. The second is the single most important determinant of success, I think, for any entrepreneur, is having the relentless determination necessary to do whatever required to succeed. And it could take years and years. And as long as you are passionate enough about it and think that what you're doing is important enough, it will be worth your time.
Okay, and last question, probably the most important question. I asked all my past speakers this question. Ready?
Yes.
Who's your favorite superhero or historical figure and why? You can take your time on the answer.
I don't know many superheroes. So I've been reading, one of the books I've been reading episodically over the sort of too long. It's a very famous book called Bearing the Cross, about MLK's journey. And he has this really striking passage right around the time when he was sort of starting the Montgomery bus boycott and kind of getting involved and not fully owning his leadership in the movement yet. And there's a bombing of his house, multiple bombings of his house, but the first real significant bombing underneath his house. And he talks about deliberating about whether he wanted to really pursue this full effort, recognizing it could take his life. And he ends up reasoning and saying, this is something that's just far more important than me, and it's something that is so important I'd be willing to give my life for it. And I think, without being morbid, I think the aspiration that I have is to try to find something I'm so passionate about that it is simply fundamentally much more important than me, and that I'm a vessel through which you can make it possible in the world, and that you be literally willing to give your life up for that. And for some people, it's their kids, and some people it's art, and some people it's the work they do, and that is what it is for me. And so I think that reading his story and the experience that he had subsequent to it, and the immense dedication and passion that he had, and literally recognizing the inevitability of what ultimately came, but embracing the historical significance regardless, and giving the ultimate price was just a beautiful, tragic, but really heroic thing.
So who is it?
MLK.
MLK, okay. So obviously you told me this answer, and I have gotten you here the autobiography of MLK here, and with the Star of Grand Strike here. So
this is awesome. I have it in Kindle, which is so much worse. So having it in this is great. No, but great.
So there's your gift. So
awesome.
Thank you for coming out, Ben.
Thank you very much.
Ben Rattray. Just stay right there.